Good evening, everybody. For this project, for this assignment, this discussion, if I can find the right word to use for this, is on Mercy Otis Warren. And she had a significant impact on people's views of the revolution. A little bit of background on her. She was born in Barnstable, Massachusetts, in September 1728, the third of 13 children, to James and Mary Otis. At the age of 26, she married James Warren, which gave her her commonly referred to name, Mercy Otis Warren. And they settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they believe they had five sons together, one of whom later passed away. And that plays into a part of her plays into the story a little bit later on, her story. She was a writer. She wrote early on. Not early on, but in the early 1770s, around the beginning of the Revolutionary period. One of her works was called the Adult. I can't say the word. Adulator. Adulateur. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And it was a satire um, of it was a satire that she had written. Uh, It was okay. It was her first published work, and it was an anonymous publication. And actually, there was her satirical work was called The Group, 1775, and that particular work was a conjecture, a what if, what might happen if the British king abrogated the Massachusetts Charter of Rights. So, and her later work, her most famous work, I would say, is called History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And it covers a span of 40 years from 1761 to 1801. And it was completed in fits and starts, so to speak. He worked on it periodically throughout that 40-year, throughout the period from the 1770s to around 1805. So over 3 decades or 3 or 4 decades, it was a work in progress. And early on, John Adams was an encourager of hers regarding her writing, and I would say he had some quote unquote selfish motives. That's my word. Selfish motives for encouraging her, trying to uh, encourage her to include some of his work. For example, his negotiations with the Dutch to help finance the revolution. So he had a bit of an ulterior motive in encouraging her writing. Um, the work was in 3 volumes, so a total of 1,300 pages, and it was published in 1805. And again, it spanned the years 1761 to 1801, and more than just a simple description of the war itself, talking about the battles and an explanation of the war. It also assessed the historical underpinnings of the war, so to speak, the the causes that led up to the war, the reasons behind why things happened the way they did. And as a contemporary uh, writing, um, she was well placed to do that because her husband was a well known well known figure in the revolutionary movement. She knew many of the principals, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others in Massachusetts, particularly. But again, it took over 3 decades for her to finish, and that allowed her to um, expand the scope of it beyond just the Simple War, which ended in 1783, carried it all the way to the end of um, the presidency of John Adams. And there were distractions. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of her sons, he passed away during the period she was writing. So that was one option. Uh, her husband's disillusionment with the revolutionary movement. Uh, the Warrens were anti-federalists, and the the main players in the revolution, the leading figures, were mostly Federalists, and this is what caused the split between her and John Adams. She also had poor health and poor eyesight, and those things also threatened to derail the project. And again, like I just mentioned, she was an anti-federalist. She was opposed to the Constitution, particularly without a Bill of Rights. And so she wrote several pieces that were published under the name of A Columbian Patriot. And the friendships between the Warrens and the Adamses disintegrated during the debate, particularly in the 1780s, while the Constitutional Convention in the aftermath. And so at that point, in the later period, the later 1780s and 1790s, um, she became more. Thomas Jefferson became more of an encourager of her work than John Adams, and in place of John Adams, who had been an earlier encourager. He felt that Adams had abandoned the revolutionary principles that brought him to that point with his in the uh, Federalist Federalist brethren. And she had her influences were also another influence of hers, in addition to John Adams, was Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, who wrote a history of England from James the First to that of the Brunswick line. And that was an 8-volume work that was published in volumes between 1763 and 1783. John Adams actually introduced the two of them together. Um, Mercy Warren had a Puritan take on the revolutionary, the history of America, believing that she had a providential viewpoint that America was chosen by God and that the revolution was divinely inspired. And this was her objection to some of the Federalists, that she saw her work as being necessary to help the nation not lose sight of its true past, the Puritan founding, the Pilgrims, the early 17th century founding of America. And she felt that the virtuous objectives of that revolution were being undermined by um, the Federalists in particular. They had what she felt to be avarice, greed, and they were betraying the Republican principles that the revolution was founded on. And her her work stands out also because of its anti-federalist flavor. The majority of the contemporary histories that were written in the during that period were of a federalist flavor, and hers was one of the few anti-federalist biased accounts of the revolution. And that's where Thomas Jefferson becomes an encourager of her later on. And John Adams, they never reconciled with the Adamses. Um, Mercy Warren and Abigail Adams, who had been close friends early on, did keep in contact, did try to stay cordial, but John Adams had a very took a very hard line with her, was very critical of her research and her skills as a writer and the reputation of her family. So it was uh, a very personal attack on her, but she stood her ground and she was committed to the veracity, the truth of what happened from the anti-federalist point of view. So one could argue that her truth may not have been the truth that others saw, but she was committed to providing what she considered to be a truthful account, regardless of what it may have cost her. So, for no other reason uh, than uh, she took it upon herself to write this landmark work. She she had a profound impact on people's viewpoints of the revolution, and her work and her book stood the test of time and was a seminal work in the early revolutionary period in the early years of the United States. So, Mercy Otis Warren. Thank you.